When my HOA ordered me to tear down my brand new solar panels in 48 hours, I thought I was doomed until one forgotten state law flipped the entire board upside down. Let me start from beginning. The morning the violation notice appeared on my front door felt strangely quiet, as if the neighborhood itself hesitated to breathe. The paper fluttered unevenly in the mild breeze, a bright white contrast against the dark paint of my entryway. For a moment, I thought it might be a delivery slip or a promotional flyer. Instead, it was the first shot in a battle I never saw coming. The notice came stamped with bold red letters that announced an immediate rule violation, framed in language meant to sound authoritative and final. According to the Homeowners Association, my newly installed solar panels constituted an unauthorized architectural modification. The wording insisted that their aesthetic incongruence threatened neighborhood property values. The board demanded removal within 48 hours, accompanied by a threat of escalating fines that could accumulate daily until compliance. The language carried all the sweetness of a hammer swinging toward glass. Just 2 days earlier, installers had finished the solar array, sleek, efficient panels that shimmered under sunlight. I had done what any conscientious homeowner might do: researched contractors, reviewed environmental benefits, and accepted the reality of rising utility costs. The installation followed city permits and passed inspection. Nothing about it felt rebellious. But here, among manicured lawns and rigid property guidelines, anything outside the familiar seemed to inspire a kind of crusade. The HOA president, a person with a reputation for policing the neighborhood like a self-appointed sentinel, had long held the belief that modern additions disrupted the community's historical character, even though the homes were barely 20 years old. Residents whispered stories about citations for mailbox paint tones differing slightly from the approved palette, or porch furniture deemed visually disruptive. All of it had seemed exaggerated until I read my own notice. I spent the next hour walking up and down my driveway, absorbing the absurdity of the situation. From the street, the panels were barely noticeable. The rooftops of neighboring houses created staggered lines that obscured them from most vantage points. Yet somehow, this minor visibility triggered an urgent enforcement response. Slowly, annoyance shifted into indignation. The HOA had not contacted me beforehand. No courtesy email, no attempted discussion. Just a demand taped to my door like a scarlet letter meant to shame me in front of the community. As I paced, I noticed curtains twitching from across the street. Neighbors silently gauging the drama. It dawned on me that this was not unique. Rather, it was part of a pattern of the board flexing its power. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by papers. The violation notice, my installation contract, city permits, and the thick, often ignored HOA handbook. I combed through the document sections on exterior modifications. Solar energy systems were not explicitly mentioned. The guidelines discussed roof replacements, paint colors, sheds, satellite dishes, and fencing. But there was nothing about solar panels. The board was claiming authority over something it had never legally defined. This discovery sparked a flicker of hope. If the rules did not specify solar panel installations, how could they enforce removal? But the HOA handbook was only one piece of the puzzle. HOAs tended to function on the assumption that what wasn't permitted was forbidden. Challenging them required more than a gap in policy. It required something indisputable. By midnight, irritation evolved into determination. I began researching solar regulations, combing through online forums and official state resources. If there was a legal foundation to stand on, I intended to find it. I refused to believe that an organization built on arbitrary opinions could negate a city-approved installation that improved both property value and sustainability. The clock neared 2 in the morning when I found it. A statewide statute buried in the Energy Code archives, a law protecting homeowners' rights to install solar energy systems regardless of HOA sentiment. Reading it felt like unearthing buried treasure. It mandated that no HOA could prohibit or impose unreasonable restrictions on solar energy collection devices, except under narrow conditions that clearly did not apply to my setup. It was specific, unambiguous, and exactly the leverage I needed. Suddenly, the story shifted. The HOA thought it could pressure me into quick compliance, but now, with the law on my side, the power dynamic had dramatically changed. I printed the statute, highlighted key sections, and laid everything neatly in a folder. Tomorrow, I would respond, not as a frightened homeowner, but as someone prepared to push back. But I also knew that HOAs rarely conceded gracefully. The morning would bring confrontation, resistance, and probably more theatrics than any of us wanted. Still, for the first time since receiving the notice, I went to bed with a sense of control. As I drifted off, panels glinting in the moonlight outside, I could almost feel the story of this neighborhood shifting, as if the quiet tension the air anticipated what was to come.
After fighting, telling story, the next morning unfolded with a subtle tension that seemed woven into the sidewalks and hedges of the neighborhood. As I walked toward the HOA clubhouse with my folder in hand, the neighborhood appeared unusually alert. A few neighbors lingered near driveways, eyes drifting toward me with a blend of sympathy, curiosity, and quiet anticipation. In communities overseen by an overzealous board, drama traveled faster than any morning breeze. The clubhouse's glass doors reflected the rising sun as I approached. Inside, the familiar sterile atmosphere awaited: low ceiling lights, perfectly aligned chairs, a table stacked with rule binders that had achieved an almost ceremonial presence. Seated behind the front table were the board members, the president in the center, posture crisp and absolute, the treasurer glancing between documents with the seriousness of someone decoding state secrets, and the secretary typing rapidly, documenting every breath that occurred within those walls. The president greeted me with a stern expression, as if the confrontation itself was an inconvenience rather than the result of their abrupt violation notice. Without preamble, they produced a printed copy of the warning and began reviewing it aloud, as though this formal recitation could solidify its legitimacy. They described the solar panels as unsightly additions, spoke about visual uniformity, and referenced property values as though invoking a sacred incantation. Their voice maintained a rhythm of assumed authority, expectant that I would simply nod, apologize, and schedule immediate removal. Instead, I placed my folder calmly on the table and slid the highlighted state statute toward them. The yellow streaks across the page glowed under the artificial lighting like silent accusations. As the president read, their expression shifted from confident disapproval toward visible discomfort. The treasurer leaned in, squinting at the text. The secretary's typing slowed, faltered, then stopped altogether. The room, once thick with officious certainty, now hummed with uncertainty. The law was unequivocal. An HOA could not prohibit solar installations unless restrictions were both reasonable and expressly stated. Aesthetic preference did not qualify. Vague concerns over property value did not qualify. And most importantly, no such restrictions existed within the community's architectural guidelines. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier composure unraveling. The president cleared their throat and attempted to reassert control by suggesting the statute might not apply to our particular community. This new claim rested on nothing more than bluster, a flimsy attempt to salvage authority that had begun to crumble the moment the law confronted it. I remained steady, explaining that the statute applied statewide, superseded HOA bylaws, and had been upheld repeatedly in legal disputes. To reinforce the point, I provided printed examples of past cases where homeowners had prevailed under the same law. Each detail seemed to erode the board's stance further. The treasurer shifted uncomfortably and murmured something about reviewing the documents more thoroughly. The secretary resumed typing, though their fingers moved hesitantly, uncertain what narrative they were supposed to record. The board had entered the meeting expecting swift compliance. Instead, they found themselves backed into an unavoidable corner.
The president, grasping for control, suggested forming a special committee to reevaluate the implications of solar installations within the community. It was a strategic delay tactic, an attempt to stretch the conflict long enough to exhaust me. But the law offered no room for discretionary committees or arbitrary deliberation. It required compliance, not discussion. I reminded them, calmly, that the 48-hour deadline for removal was unenforceable under state law, and that any attempt to impose fines would constitute a violation of my protected rights. The words lingered in the room like unwelcome truths. For several strained moments, the board sat in silence, grappling with the realization that their authority had collided with a legal barrier they could not bulldozer through. The president pursed their lips, a reluctant acknowledgement flickering behind their eyes. They attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, but the word felt hollow. The board had overreached, and everyone in the room understood it. Finally, the president announced that the violation notice would be temporarily suspended pending further legal review. It wasn't an admission of defeat, but it was the closest they could come without outright surrender. I accepted the statement, knowing that the law had already decided the outcome, and stood to leave. As I exited the clubhouse, the air outside felt lighter. A sense of empowerment settled over me, not born from confrontation, but from the realization that standing up to arbitrary authority was not only possible, but necessary. When I returned home, the solar panels gleamed proudly under the midday sun, their reflective surfaces unbothered by the turmoil they had inadvertently sparked. The neighborhood remained quiet, though I sensed ripples of the morning's events traveling between houses. Neighbors peered discreetly from windows, no doubt eager to piece together the unfolding conflict. But I knew the board would not give up easily. A temporary suspension was merely a pause before their next attempt to assert control. I anticipated letters, meetings, policy rewrites, and all manner of inventive resistance. The battle was far from over, yet momentum had shifted unmistakably in my favor. And so, with documents secured and determination intact, I prepared for whatever came next. The HOA had picked the wrong homeowner to intimidate, and the coming days would make that unmistakably clear.
In the days that followed the confrontation, the neighborhood transformed into a quiet stage, where tension played out in subtle gestures, lingering glances, whispered exchanges, and a faint air of anticipation clinging to every sidewalk. Word had spread quickly, moving from porch to porch, reaching the ears of residents weary of the board's long-standing domineering approach. My solar panels, once simply a personal upgrade, had become a symbol of resistance, unexpected, unplanned, yet undeniably visible. 2 mornings after the meeting, I received a thick envelope from the HOA addressed with a formality that bordered on theatrical. Inside was a letter attempting to reinterpret the guidelines to imply the board could still restrict installations deemed visually disruptive. They cited phrases from unrelated sections of the handbook, stitching them together as though hoping that sheer volume of words could compensate for their lack of legal ground. The letter also announced an emergency board meeting, open to all residents, a gathering intended, no doubt, to reassert their authority and rally support. What unfolded at that meeting, however, shifted the power dynamics of the community in a way the board never anticipated. Residents packed the clubhouse, filling chairs, lining walls, and spilling into the hallway. The atmosphere hummed with cautious discontent. For years, frustrations with petty enforcement had simmered beneath the surface, citations for lawn heights off by half an inch, warnings about holiday decorations lingering a day too long, reprimands for recycling bins visible from the street. My conflict had provided the spark that illuminated those grievances. The president opened the meeting with an elaborate speech about preserving community standards. But as they spoke, the room's energy shifted. Residents exchanged uncertain glances, skeptical frowns, and occasional headshakes. The language felt outdated, oddly authoritarian, and increasingly out of sync with what people wanted in their own neighborhood. When the floor opened for comments, the room ignited. One resident after another voiced frustrations long kept quiet.
They spoke about arbitrary enforcement, inconsistent interpretations of rules, and the board's habit of using fear rather than communication. Some expressed embarrassment that our neighborhood, one that prided itself on modern living, was attempting to restrict sustainable energy solutions. Others questioned why the board was prioritizing aesthetics over practicality, safety, and environmental responsibility. My turn came, and I stepped forward with calm clarity, presenting the state statute once more. The law was displayed on a projector screen, its language crisp and undeniable. Residents leaned in, recognizing its authority instantly. The highlight marks glowed under the room's muted lighting, each stroke a reminder of the board's oversight. As the board attempted to counter the statute with vague interpretations, murmurs spread through the crowd. The treasurer appeared visibly uncomfortable, the secretary struggled to keep up with the sudden surge of objections, and the president's composure thinned with each passing moment. Their earlier confidence evaporated under public scrutiny. A resident in the back raised a pointed question. If the board had truly understood the law, why issue a removal notice at all? Another resident asked why the board hadn't consulted legal counsel before threatening fines. The room's energy sharpened, shifting from frustration to accountability. Finally, after nearly an hour of mounting pressure, the president conceded, grudgingly, that the HOA would rescind the violation entirely. The announcement was met with a wave of relieved murmurs and a few quiet cheers. The president attempted to soften the admission by claiming the board had been misinformed and that procedures would be updated, but the room had already sensed the truth. The HOA had overstepped, been caught, and had no choice but to retreat. The outcome did not end with the rescinded violation. Momentum continued to build as residents demanded broader changes. Discussions arose about revising the handbook to reflect modern standards, limiting the board's unilateral power, and establishing checks against arbitrary enforcement. Some even proposed replacing certain board members at the next election cycle. The seeds of reform had been planted, and the board understood that the neighborhood's tolerance for intimidation had evaporated. Walking home after the meeting, I felt a quiet sense of closure settling in. The solar panels gleamed under the late afternoon light, no longer symbols of conflict, but reminders of what persistence could accomplish. The neighborhood no longer watched with silent curiosity. Instead, several residents approached with supportive nods and appreciative smiles. Conversations that once felt tense now carried a tone of shared empowerment. The board's authority had not vanished, but it had been humbled, realigned by the law they had ignored and the community they had underestimated. Their decision to challenge my installation had backfired spectacularly, exposing cracks in their leadership and catalyzing long overdue change. By the end of the week, the HOA officially amended its policies to comply with state law, adding a section expressly permitting solar energy systems. The amendment, once their reluctant concession, became a point of progress for the entire community. The president remained in office, though with noticeably tempered behavior, and the atmosphere around the neighborhood lightened. As I stood in my driveway, looking up at the panels that had sparked the transformation, I realized that what began as a simple home improvement had become something far more meaningful. It served as a reminder that rights mattered, that knowledge mattered, and that standing firm against unjust pressure could ripple outward, altering an entire community's trajectory. The HOA had tried to ban my solar panels, but in the end, they had only succeeded in spotlighting a law they themselves had forgotten, and in doing so, they changed far more than they ever intended.